Fairview Regional had stood on the corner of Clement and Fifth since 1952, the kind of institution that printed its founding year on everything. Letterheads, coffee mugs, the brass plaque by the front entrance that nobody stopped to read anymore. For 7 decades, it had been the hospital where people in this county were born, where they recovered from accidents on Route 9, where they died with family holding their hands. The staff knew each other's children's names. The attending physicians had offices cluttered with thank you cards going back 15 years. Then Gareth Moss arrived. He came in February, on a Tuesday so gray and cold it felt like the sky itself was reluctant. He had been appointed by the hospital's parent company, Meridian Health Group, after a series of quarterly losses that had made the board nervous. Moss was not a doctor. He had never treated a patient, never walked a ward at 2 a.m, never made a decision where the cost of being wrong was a human life. His background was in commercial real estate and logistics. He had, according to his LinkedIn profile, restructured 3 regional businesses in the past 4 years. 2 of them had since closed. He wore the same dark suit every day, slightly different tie. He moved through the hospital's corridors the way a building inspector moves through a property he intends to condemn. Eyes up, calculating, never quite making contact with the people around him. The staff noticed. They noticed when he held his first all-hands meeting and spent 40 minutes on overhead reduction without once mentioning patient care. They noticed when he replaced the break room coffee machine with a coin-operated one. They noticed when he reassigned 2 of the overnight custodial staff and didn't replace them, so that by 3 a.m., the hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic applied too thin over surfaces that needed more. What they didn't notice at first was the woman who had transferred in from County General 3 weeks before Moss arrived. Her name was Tessa Barrow. She was 31 years old, slight, with the kind of face that people described as pleasant when they meant forgettable. She wore her hair pulled back in a practical knot and moved through the hospital with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned, long ago, that the fastest way to get things done was to not be seen doing them. She was listed on the staffing roster as a floor nurse, 3rd shift, surgical recovery ward. Her credentials were good. Not extraordinary, just good. She didn't volunteer for committees. She didn't eat lunch in the main cafeteria where the social hierarchies played out over trays of institutional food. She worked her shift, she documented meticulously, and she went home. What the roster didn't say, because she hadn't offered the information and nobody had asked, was that before nursing school Tessa Barrow had spent 6 years as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. She had treated gunshot wounds in conditions that would make most emergency rooms look like fully equipped surgical suites. She had made triage decisions, real ones, the kind where choosing one patient meant not choosing another, in the back of vehicles moving at speed through places that didn't appear on tourist maps. She had a scar along her left forearm from a piece of shrapnel she'd removed herself because there hadn't been anyone else. She didn't talk about any of this. It was simply part of her, the way a carpenter's hands are part of him, visible only in the work. She had come to Fairview because it was 20 minutes from her mother's house in Clement County, and her mother had recently been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. That was the whole reason. Not ambition, not strategy, proximity. For the first 3 weeks, Tessa watched Gareth Moss the way she had learned to watch things she didn't yet understand. Without obvious attention, from the periphery, building a picture from small details. She saw how he spoke to the nursing staff versus how he spoke to the attending physicians. Different register entirely. To doctors, he was collegial, almost deferential, asking questions that had the shape of interest, but the substance of inventory taking. To nurses and aides, he simply didn't speak at all, except through memos. The memos came often. The first one, distributed in his 2nd week, announced that all non-emergency supply requisitions would now require dual approval. The floor supervisor and the department administrator, with a minimum 5-day processing window. The floor supervisors understood immediately what this meant. It meant that the extra sterile gloves they ordered, when flu season made everyone's hands raw, would be delayed. It meant the replacement blood pressure cuffs that the night shift had been requesting since October would still not come. It meant the informal system of just grab it from the supply closet and we'll sort the paperwork later, that had kept the floor running smoothly for years, was now a compliance violation. Tessa read the memo twice, folded it carefully, and put it in her locker. The second memo, 2 weeks later, announced a new scheduling protocol. Shifts would be restructured to reduce labor redundancy during low census periods. In practice, this meant that the window between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., the hours that nurses called the quiet hours, though anyone who had worked them knew they were anything but, would now run with one fewer nurse per floor. The math was simple. Fewer people, same number of patients, same number of emergencies, same number of moments when a patient's oxygen saturation dropped without warning at 4 a.m. And you needed to be there already, not in the middle of crossing from the other end of the ward. The charge nurses brought their concerns to the nursing supervisor, Helen Garza, who brought them to the department administrator, who sent an email to Moss's office. The response came through his assistant 3 days later. The restructuring would proceed as planned. If census increased, staffing levels would be reviewed. Helen Garza had worked at Fairview for 22 years. Tessa watched her read that response at the nurse's station, watched her fold the printout with the precise, controlled movements of a person who is very practiced at not letting her face do what it wants to do. Helen put the paper in a folder, labeled the folder, and filed it. She had been doing this for years. She knew what filed complaints looked like after 5 years. Nothing. What happened next happened on a Thursday night in early April, during the quiet hours. Tessa was 40 minutes into a 12-hour shift when the call came from room 14. The patient was a 63-year-old man named Gerald Hutchins, post-operative from a hip replacement that morning. Routine procedure. He had come through surgery well. His evening checks had been stable. He had eaten about half his dinner and told the aide who brought it that he was looking forward to seeing his grandchildren that weekend. At 2:17 a.m., his call light activated. Tessa was closest. She came through the door to find Hutchins sitting partially upright, one hand pressed to his chest, breathing in the careful, deliberate way that people breathe when breathing has stopped being automatic and started requiring concentration. His face was the color of old putty. She had seen that color before, in places that had nothing to do with hospital recovery wards. She was already moving. Call button for the crash cart, 2 fingers to his wrist, eyes on the monitor, when she noticed something that stopped one layer of her mind cold even while the rest of her kept functioning. The IV line running into Hutchins's left arm was connected to an infusion pump, one of the Helios 3 units that the hospital had switched to last fall. The pump's display showed a normal flow rate. The pump was making its soft, rhythmic sound. Everything about it looked correct, except the medication bag was full. It should have been half empty by now, 3 hours into his post-operative infusion. She had hung it herself at the start of shift. She traced the line from the bag to the pump to the patient in the time it takes most people to read a sentence. The check valve on the IV line had failed. The pump was cycling. The display was reporting delivery, but nothing was actually reaching him. His pain medication, yes, and she could see from his vitals that his discomfort level was rising. But more critically, the IV fluids and the prophylactic anticoagulant they'd started him on post-op. Nothing had been delivered for what her mental math told her was close to 2 hours. She called out to the corridor, a single sharp word, and adjusted his positioning while she worked the line. It took her 45 seconds to identify the failed valve, swap the line from the emergency supply cart in the hallway, the one that had taken her 2 days of paperwork to get restocked after Moss's new supply protocol, and reestablish the infusion. 45 seconds was faster than it should have been possible for anyone not very specifically trained in keeping people alive in environments where supplies were limited and every second had a cost. Gerald Hutchins's color began to improve within minutes. His breathing evened. By the time the on-call physician, Dr. Anita Sorrells, arrived, Hutchins was stable, and Tessa had already documented the failed check valve with the lot number, the installation date, and the approximate duration of the failure. Dr. Sorrells read the documentation. She looked at Tessa with the particular look that physicians sometimes give nurses who have done something that the hierarchy doesn't quite have a box for. "Good catch," she said, which was a considerable understatement. "The valve failure isn't isolated," Tessa said. She said it the way she said most things. Quiet, direct, without decoration. "I've seen 2 other Helios 3 units behave inconsistently on this floor over the past month. The display reports delivery within parameters, but the flow rate at the patient end doesn't match. I've been tracking it." She had been tracking it because tracking things was what she did. In her locker was a small notebook. Not digital, paper, the kind that doesn't require a password or a server, with dates, room numbers, patient identifiers, and notations about IV pump behavior that she had begun keeping the week she arrived, not because she had suspected anything yet, but because she had learned, in environments less forgiving than this one, that the things you write down when nothing is wrong are the things that save you when something is. Dr. Sorrells took the notebook from Tessa's hand, read it for a long moment, and said nothing. Then she said, "I need to make some calls." What followed was the kind of institutional unraveling that takes weeks to become visible, but is, in retrospect, inevitable from the moment someone starts paying attention. The hospital's biomedical engineering team pulled all 11 Helios 3 units on the surgical recovery ward. 6 of them showed the same defect under testing, a manufacturing issue with the internal check valve that caused the pump to continue cycling and reporting accurately while actual fluid delivery was interrupted. The manufacturer had received similar reports from 2 other hospital systems and had begun a quiet internal review that had not yet resulted in a formal recall notification. Nobody at Fairview had known, because nobody at Fairview had been watching closely enough to catch the pattern. The monitoring systems that should have flagged the discrepancy had been recalibrated the previous fall during a cost reduction update that Moss had approved, trimming the sensitivity threshold to reduce false alarms, because false alarms meant staff time, and staff time meant money. The irony was not subtle. Helen Garza, when she was shown Tessa's notebook, was quiet for a long time. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades doing exactly what Tessa had done, paying attention, documenting, filing concerns through the proper channels, and who had learned to absorb the weight of knowing things that the institution wasn't ready to hear. She looked at the notebook, and then she looked at Tessa, and she said, "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the first week," Tessa said. Helen nodded slowly, as though this answered a question she had been trying to formulate for some time. "Where were you before County General?" "Before that," Tessa said, "I was somewhere else." She didn't elaborate. Helen didn't push. There was something in Tessa's manner, not coldness, exactly, more the particular self-containment of someone who has operated in conditions that require you to be very careful about what you project and to whom, that made elaboration feel unnecessary and also slightly beside the point. The biomedical report went to the hospital's Patient Safety Committee, which was chaired by Dr. Sorrells. The Patient Safety Committee was required, by the hospital's accreditation standards, to report device failures with potential patient impact to the parent company. Meridian Health Group received the report on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, the report had also been sent, by a route that Meridian's legal team would later spend considerable time attempting to trace, to the State Department of Health and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That route was Tessa. She had sent it from a public library computer, which was perhaps excessive in its caution, but which reflected a habit of operational thinking that she had never quite shed. She had also, because she was thorough, sent a copy to the investigative health reporter at the state's largest newspaper, whose email address she had found in 30 seconds. She had done this not because she was angry, or not primarily because she was angry, though she was. She had done it because she had sat with Gerald Hutchins the morning after his near miss and listened to him talk about his grandchildren. A boy, 7, who was obsessed with dinosaurs, and twin girls, 4, who had recently decided that every meal required a formal tablecloth. And she had understood with the clarity that certain experiences give you so, that the difference between Gerald Hutchins telling that story and not telling it had been a matter of 45 seconds and a paper notebook, and that the reason those 45 seconds had been close was that someone had been making decisions about this hospital's operations from behind a desk in a suit without understanding, or perhaps without caring, what those decisions cost at the level where the actual work happened. Gareth Moss received the state inspection notice on a Friday morning. Tessa was told about his reaction secondhand by an administrative assistant named Kim Petrov, who had a gift for recounting scenes with the detail of someone who had spent years listening while appearing not to. According to Kim, Moss had read the notice twice, set it down on his desk very carefully, and then asked in a tone of genuine bewilderment where the referral had come from. Kim had told him she didn't know. This was technically true. The inspection took 2 days. The inspectors went through the supply chain documentation, the staffing records, the equipment maintenance logs, the recalibration orders from the previous fall. They interviewed nursing staff. Several nurses, apparently, had things they had been waiting to say. The interviews ran long. The Helios 3 manufacturer issued a formal recall notification the following week. It cited potential flow delivery inconsistencies under specific operating conditions and provided instructions for return and replacement. 3 other hospital systems that had reported similar anomalies were named in the documentation. Fairview's early identification of the defect was noted. The notation did not include SU's name because the biomedical report had been attributed to the engineering team, which was procedurally correct and personally fine with Tessa, who had not done any of this for credit. Meridian Health Group placed Gareth Moss on administrative leave, pending review of operational and compliance matters, approximately 3 weeks after the inspection concluded. The review took 6 weeks. At the end of it, Moss was not reinstated. The press release cited a mutual decision to part ways, which was the language companies used when they needed the narrative to be tidy and the actual events were not. Helen Garza was asked, in the interim, whether she would consider taking on an expanded administrative role, essentially the hospital administrative function, added to her existing responsibilities, with a title upgrade and additional compensation. She took 2 days to consider it, then declined. She said, with the candor that was one of her most consistent qualities, that she was a charge nurse and that charge nursing was what she was good at, and that adding an administrative layer between herself and the floor would make her worse at the thing she was actually good at, which seemed to her like a poor trade. The hospital's board found this baffling. Most of the floor staff found it entirely predictable. Nobody asked Tessa whether she wanted a different role, which was also fine with her. She had not been asked because, as far as most of the administrative structure was concerned, she was still a floor nurse who had made a good catch in room 14. That framing suited her. What she had, at the end of it, was something simpler, and in her estimation more useful than a title. The knowledge that the Helios 3 units had been replaced, that the staffing levels for the quiet hours had been quietly restored, pending the compliance review's recommendations, and that the supply requisition protocol had been revised to allow emergency clinical needs to bypass the dual approval delay. These were not glamorous outcomes. They did not make for a satisfying press release, but they were the difference, on any given Tuesday night at 3 a.m., between a nurse being able to do her job and a nurse being unable to do it, which was the difference that had always, in Tessa's experience, been the only one that mattered. Gerald Hutchins was discharged on a Saturday, 9 days after his surgery. He had recovered well. He had, by all accounts, thoroughly enjoyed the visits from his grandchildren, including a 3-hour session in which the 7-year-old had educated the entire nursing staff on the dietary habits of the Cretaceous period. Hutchins stopped at the nurse's station on his way out and left a card, the kind with a generic thank you, on the front and blank space inside, in which he had written, in the careful handwriting of someone for whom writing had become effortful. To the night staff, whoever you are, you took care of me when I couldn't take care of myself. I won't forget it. Tessa was not at the station when he left. She was in room 9, helping a post-operative patient work through her first attempts at walking the corridor, 4 feet at a time, the woman gripping the IV pole with both hands and moving with the fierce, exhausted determination of someone relearning something her body used to know how to do without thinking. She read the card later, on her break, sitting alone in the supply room, with the door cracked because the break room's coin-operated machine still hadn't been removed, and she found the sound of it irritating. She read it twice, which was enough, and then she put it in her locker next to the notebook. The notebook was nearly full. She had already bought a second one. On a morning in May, when the maple trees outside the hospital's main entrance were doing what maple trees do in May in this part of the country, Helen Garza found Tessa at the end of her shift writing up a patient transfer and said, not quite casually, "You know, there's a new administrator starting next month, former chief nursing officer at a system in Ohio. She's got real clinical background." "Good," Tessa said without looking up from her documentation. "I thought you'd want to know. I do want to know." She finished the note, capped her pen. "Is she going to listen to the floor staff?" Helen considered this. She took a day to walk the wards before she accepted the offer, asked to shadow the night shift. Tessa nodded once. "Then she's probably going to be okay." She picked up her bag, said goodbye to the aide coming on for morning shift, and walked out through the main entrance, past the brass plaque with the founding year on it. She stopped for a moment, which she did not usually do. The morning was cool and smelled of cut grass and car exhaust, and the particular combination of things that means a hospital is near. Something functional and chemical and alive all at once. She had grown up near a hospital. Her mother had worked in one, briefly, before Tessa was born. It was not a remarkable smell. It was just the smell of a place where people came when they needed help, and other people tried to give it. She walked to her car. She had to be back at 7 p.m.